Muito boa tarde, bem-vindos a mais uma das Conferências da Garagem. Em nome da Garagem Sul, queria agradecer a todos a vossa presença. Já começamos a sentir nestas conversas e nestes encontros a formação de um certo sentido de comunidade, a ver caras conhecidas e a perceber que na Garagem Sul estamos a conversar e a construir digamos, uma comunidade próxima do debate e do pensamento da arquitetura, e é com grande prazer que vos acolho aqui hoje e agradecer particularmente ao Laurent Stalder, que vem fazer esta apresentação, O que acontece à arquitetura. Estávamos aqui a discutir se tinha ponto de interrogação ou se não tinha ponto de interrogação. O Laurent Stalder é professor de Teoria e História da Arquitetura na ETH, na Escola Politécnica de Zurique, onde também se diplomou e onde faz parte do Instituto de Teoria e História da Arquitetura. É autor de vários livros. Tenho particular memória de um livro sobre o François d'Allegret, e vocês devem também conhecer alguns livros sobre o Valerio Olgiati, e faz parte de uma geração de arquitetos que se dedicam à teoria e à história sem perder o fio da arquitetura. E no contexto, no quadro de Zurique, é bastante singular perceber a sua relação com ateliês de projeto, com o pensamento do projeto, com, digamos, a teoria e a história associadas, e a crítica, poderíamos assim dizer, associadas à prática, ao desenho e àquilo que é a disciplina da arquitetura. E sendo esse o objetivo destas conferências da garagem, continuar a olhar para a prática com um sentido crítico e um pensamento intelectual sobre aquilo que, como arquitetos, fazemos e construímos, que o convidamos, e por isso, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Laurent, for being here. Please join me welcoming Laurent.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here this night, and excuse me that I speak today in English. Unfortunately, my skills are limited. Obviously, if one wants to deal with what happens to architecture or with the becoming of architecture, one has to deal, I guess, with history. And as I was introduced, if I understood well, as a historian, you will forgive me if I make a small and somehow quite obvious historical introduction. If one would like to summarize the last 150 or 200 years of modern architecture, one would perhaps have one key characteristic, which is the search of the new ways of living, new ways of building, new materials, metal, glass, concrete, plastic, titanium, new construction method from prefabrication to digital manufacturing, new design processes, formal in the 30s, systemic in the 60s, complex in the 90s, a new building task from the object of modernists, the Siedlung, the minimal flat, up to the row, up to a more complex form of contemporary design, which we still call a new form of design, and which would perhaps encompass the whole environment and not only the object. What characterizes this search is always the claim that this way of proceeding, this way of understanding, this way of going on is a new way. And of course, we have new protagonists. In the 30s, we would call them pioneers. In the 60s, probably visionaries. And today, we call them simply Pritzker Prize winners. And they all change, as you know, every year. So again, they are new every year. And we could even go further on and say, we are also looking for new humans. The standardized human of modernism up to the soldier and worker, as we would call them, and today, perhaps the more individualized personality or even the cyborg of postmodernism. And as Le Corbusier's English translator had put it, new is the path towards a new architecture. In short, we are again and again in search of newness in all its dimensions, from construction to new design processes, to new ways of living, to building, and as I said, new protagonists, and probably also new users. Interestingly enough, and I'm still in the historical narrative, this newness is not only a characteristic of the last 150 years, but it would become its attribute. And perhaps the best examples are the one given in the 30s, where, as you can see, the Neue Baukens, the new architecture, the modern architecture, and the international style somehow collapse together, and we speak somehow about contemporary architecture as a new modern architecture. But this is not only true for the 30s. In the 50s, we would have a fight between new humanism, new empiricism, new Palladianism, new brutalism, and as you can see, after 12 years somehow, already the term finds its end, and this goes on, of course. Modernism, after modernism, we are postmodern, and even the postmodern, as Charles Jenks put it, are looking for new approaches and for a new style. So somehow, as you see it, if we make a very, very short historical view back, we could say, yes, this is probably a sound way of looking back into modern history. Yet, if we agree that we are searching for the new, somehow we have to get rid of something, and somehow this is the second narrative I would like to introduce, somehow, that if you claim that something is new, somehow you have to claim that something becomes old. And interestingly enough, so here is the classical Swiss example from Hans Schmidt, from the review ABC. As you can see here, the monumental representative building somehow belongs to the old world, as the new world is a world of communication, of technology, and of communication. And the arguments change all the time, and this is very funny if you look through this lens into history. Somehow, there is a very nice little booklet about from the late 19th century, where an architect argues why the styles are changing all the time of historicism. And his argument is that we get bored with the old one. So somehow, as soon as we get bored, we have to follow up and find a new artistic form. But in modernism, it would be the emancipation from outdated materials. So glass, concrete, and steel would replace old materials like brick and stone, or new wallpaper patterns, as you can see here, would replace the old wallpaper patterns in Bruno Taut's little brochure on new housing forms. Of course, Also, new monumentality would replace old monumentality, as in Siegfried Gideon's famous claim. And this could be followed on and on. So, Sachlichkeit, objectivity would replace Art Nouveau. New objectivity would replace expressionism. Il movimento razionale would replace Novecento. New brutalism would replace a trivial Corbusian modernism. And even when somehow, as in the 50s, a critique of modernism raised with a rediscovery of the old, it's somehow the new old which replaces the old new. Somehow it's the search for this kind of new landscape or townscape which replaces the modernism row housing. And this is true, of course, for postmodernism with Léon Krier. Somehow this is the real city which replaces the old new or new old city which replaces the modern city. And famously, this differentiation between old and new, between outdated and contemporary, is best seen in the first pages of Charles Jenks' The Language of Postmodern Architecture, where you have to destroy somehow representative of modern architecture to argue in a better way about the new style, which is obviously the postmodern style. So again, postmodernism displaces international style, deconstructivism replaces postmodernism, parametricism replaces deconstructivism, or whatever new term. So now we had, in this short history, we had an argument about the new, an argument about the old, and now we come somehow to a third point. And the point is, if we would take this opposition between new and old, not just as a rhetorical figure, because all we have seen now somehow is about rhetorics. We have seen books where architects or historians argue about what has to be achieved and what has to be relegated to the past. So if we would not understand this old-new opposition as a rhetorical figure, but try to understand it in its physical conditions, not arguing about the succession between modernism, postmodernism, deconstructivism, and parametricism, but think what it means when new materials become old, when new construction methods become weak, when new functions become outdated. So not to think somehow about this linear argumentation of Gideon, who somehow shows a linearity between an engineering building and its architectural realization. So how inside a gap of 50 years we could overcome somehow this divide between architecture and engineering and come to a new architecture, but somehow to think about modernism, not in a linear sense, but somehow in this, from this perspective, what does it mean somehow when the Villa Savoie is really old, when its material decay, where it's not anymore usable. So not any longer postulate new functions, new constructions, new materials, new infrastructures, new technical installation, but to study specific functions, building elements, materials, infrastructure, and construction, and think where the new become outdated, where the material fails, where the infrastructure no longer performs, where the construction does not meet the demands required. So the question should be, what would the implications therefore be where one to seriously pay attention to the passage of time and to equally study architecture at the point where the building and its users do not follow the program? where the architecture breaks down, is destroyed, is abandoned, or simply does not fulfill its premises. So to study modern architecture not in terms of its postulated innovation, but in terms of what happens when time elapses. The accidents, this is the Latin word for what happens, is the accidents, as Virilio, as a French philosopher, has recalled it. So the fourth point now is the accident in architecture. This is an easy one somehow. Now I have an easy chapter because you're going to laugh all the time. And strangely, the question of the accidents, of what happens, has not so much been investigated, at least in architectural history and theory. For sure, one reason for that is that there are rare moments of total failure in the discipline, like the Gare Montparnasse, where the train would break through the main wall, or the Hyatt Regency in Kansas City, where the walkway collapsed, or the famous accidents at the airport Charles de Gaulle, where the concourse of one of the gates collapsed in 2004. But I would argue this has also a lot to do with the modern rhetoric, which is much more interested by the new than by the things which becomes old. And if you look carefully at some of the publication of the time, you find, for instance, in Siegfried Gideon's, not only the comfort dimension of this old sofa, but somehow also its uncanny dimension. If you look here at this hand or at this lion, which inspired Max Ernst in Siegfried Gideon's book. Or sometimes you find this kind of a caricature still in Siegfried Gideon's, where somehow the breakdown of a technical system is shown, but it's much more shown in a playful way and not in an analytical way. Sometimes you find, as in Rainer Benham's, as an English historian, so much fascinated by infrastructure, where he speaks, for instance, about air pollution in 19th century London, or this very nice publication on the Euston Station in London, where Alison and Peter Smithson, with the historian Nikolaus Pevsner, would write a book about the destruction of this building and somehow would deplore the obsolescence of technical building and their uses, or perhaps more known, these pre-postmodern publication somehow who show the failure of the modern premises, like Peter Blake's God Owns Junkyard, where he shows next to the progress of modern infrastructure and modern architecture also its other side, as he called it, the junkyard, or Ziedler's book on Berlin, where he speaks about a city which has been murdered through modern architecture. This omission of the accident in architectural history and theory is all the more surprising somehow, as the idea of failure, the idea of the accident is a modern topic. Indeed, the pre-modern would speak about catastrophes, about natural catastrophes, which would be larger than any possible technical failure. And what characterizes the modern period is somehow the inversion of this logic, that the technical accident becomes more important than the natural events. Think about Chernobyl, or think about car accidents and as a number of people who can die, and the consequences these collapses or destruction or accidents or failures can have. And so it's not a chance that you find around the 30s, in the same period as modern architecture is codified, a series of books, and I just brought one, perhaps disregarded books like this one by the philosopher and historian Ernst Jünger, The Perilous Moment, where he shows the fascination he and his epoch have for spectacular accidents like the Titanic, or train disasters, or the Zeppelin disasters, but also car accidents, or plane accidents, or ship accidents. And I think this is especially an interesting approach, that insofar as it helps us somehow to problematize the modern period and to think about another aspect of it. Especially it helps us somehow to think that the technical accident is not an exception. The accident is a risk inherent to every technical object, and perhaps as this elevator by Otis is the best example of it. Somehow what he does, he somehow shows what would happen if an accident would happen, if the row, as you see here, which is cut, what would happen if the row would be cut. So the accident is not an exception. The accident becomes a risk inherent to the technical object, one that is mathematically calculable, economically evaluable, and in the last resort also insurable. That's how the risk assurance work today. Somehow they foresaw certain risks of possible accident. And indeed, to evaluate the risk of the technical object, but also the risk of architecture and architecture innovations, would become one of the major preoccupations of societies following the post-war. And one, perhaps, who wrote most extensively on this question is without doubt Paul Virilio in his exhibition Ce qui arrive, What Happens, or L'accident original, the original accident, where somehow he tries to propose a theory, a new theory of the accident. And I think there are two important points in the theory of accident, that technologies not only rush ahead of the users, who take some time somehow to get used to a new technological object, but he also says invention outspaces their inventors. So somehow the inventors somehow do not know what will happen to the technical object they invented. And in his catastrophic vision, which is illustrated with all the possible accidents from Bhopal to Chernobyl, he then argues that the fatal inconsistency of scientists is that they do not recognize the inherent dangers of their own invention. And he argues then, inventing a ship is also inventing its sinking. Inventing the car is inventing the car accident. Inventing the train is to invent the train crash. And in analogy, we can then try to somehow extrapolate it to architecture and say, inventing the flat roof and using tar paper is inventing the leak. inventing heating is inventing overheating. And if you read some accident reports, there is a very funny one on a social housing in London, which overheated during the hottest possible summer. So it was not only like 30 degrees outside, but you had also the heating at 35 degrees, because they had a central system somehow, which was difficult to control. Or inventing the ventilation is also inventing the draft, as we may feel here. And inventing automatic revolving door is inventing the glitch, and inventing social housing, and sorry to be here a little bit cynical, is also inventing the slum. But now we could look at it from a very pessimistic point of view somehow, and say, yes, good, then we have to go back somehow and retreat from this research that characterizes modern societies. But perhaps we could also turn the argument and say that the invention and even the breakdown of invention allows us to understand the system. As soon as we have an air draft, we begin to think about artificial air condition, for instance. And this is particularly true for architecture somehow, because we are used somehow that architecture has to perform perfectly. And it's only from the moment on somehow where something breaks down that we begin to think, for instance, about artificial air, that we begin to think about the comfort we have. It's only from the moment on somehow where a promise fails that we begin to think and to understand what is at stake. So if I speak here about the accident or about what is happening, I'm not so much pessimistic about, like the postmodernists and their rejection of rationalism, but I'm much more interested in its epistemological dimension. As I'm interested in the accident somehow as a gain of knowledge, not as a rejection of rationalism, but at the possibility somehow to broaden the enlightening scope of modernity. And this is somehow the reason why I think it is worth to think for a moment also about this dimension of architecture and especially of modern architecture. Now, the fifth point, the first was old, the second, the newness, the second was old and new, the third was the materiality, the fourth was the notion of the accident, and now the question arises about the accident in architecture. What can we learn out of it? And probably this is the reason we all gather today together here around this topic. So somehow if we come back to the Villa Savoye, the question would not only be to understand the Villa Savoye for its celebrated 5 points, which we learn at architectural schools, the pilotis, the toit de terrasse, la fenêtre en longueur, le plan libre, la façade libre, and so on. We have it in our architectural unconscious. But perhaps to think about the roof garden not only as the recuperation somehow of the build surface, but also as a seepage of rainwater inside the house. To think about the free plan not only for the liberation of the plan paralysé, as Le Corbusier would call it, but also as an acoustic problem inside a the house, to think about the free facade not only as a free distribution of the opening, but also about the necessity of reinforcing, as it happened here, of the framework. And all the examples I quoted, it's a little bit an easy joke. Of course, Le Corbusier was such a prolific and brilliant architect somehow that he is also an easy surface to project these kinds of critique. But all the critique I gave you were somehow critiques which were brought up by the Savoy family. Madame Savoy writing to Le Corbusier is that it would be really not only in her bedroom, but also in her bathroom, that she would hear the noise of her son, and of course the engineers in the 60s would have to rethink the structure of the Villa Savoy. Or to take another example, what would it mean to think the engineering building in the University of Leicester by James Stirling, not only for its world-class architecture as it was celebrated at the time, but also perhaps to think about the leaks, the draft, and the extremes of hot and cold. This is a quotation of the time, due to its flimsy aluminium stick system, which would then be repaired 50 years later and tested here with garden water. Or to think about Park Hill Estate not only as a social reformulation, rethinking of Le Corbusier's unité d'habitation, a housing which was celebrated at the time as they put somehow the corridors, the main corridor in the center of the building, in the unity of Le Corbusier. They put it on the facade, making it to a street in the air. So not to think about Park Hill not only as a rethinking of Le Corbusier's unité d'habitation, but also as a social failure after Thatcher's neoliberal turnaround. Or the dance theater in Den Haag by Rem Koolhaas, not only as an intelligent use of cheap materials, not only as an intelligent flattering of the differences between old and new, high and low culture, but also to think about it through its outward technology, backstage and auditorium, which at the end forced the demolition as the restoration costs were as high as the cost of a new building. So these are some examples I took some star architects out because it's an easier task to do, but I could list numerous examples of other buildings. Now, it's much more difficult somehow to formulate a meaningful response to this list of failure or of accidents in the broadest sense of what happens to a building, as somehow architecture theory and history is not equipped to answer this question. I have to say we are less equipped as assurance companies, which are quite well equipped somehow to calculate all these things. Now, what could be the different approaches? We could, for instance, distinguish different typologies, and we could distinguish between various forms of faulty elements. So we could speak about the lack of proper functions, the lack of sunscreens, poor materials, a leaking roof, faulty constructions, or failure in concrete elements. So we would somehow distinguish different failures inside a building, inside building elements, and somehow through that we could make one category. Another category would be a more complex one, not only to focus on a singular element, but to focus on systems, like climate control, where somehow you don't have one element which is faulty, but probably you have the interplay between different elements, like a glass roof, a ventilation, and the heating. So it becomes, and the orientation of the building. So it becomes more complex already to see where is the failure exactly. Is it the heating? Is it the roof? Is it the air circulation? Or is it the orientation of the building? So this second category would deal more with building systems. And it could become even more complicated if we wouldn't deal with elements, we wouldn't deal with systems, but we would also encompass the building process. So suddenly we would have to put in our equation the raising of labor costs, which would change the budget throughout the building process, or the alteration of the program, or legal uncertainties, which are resolved throughout the process or are not resolved throughout the building process. Inflation, for instance, so economic issues which would force somehow to change certain materials or to avoid building the whole program, the change of clients, or the unstable building ground. So you see, we are now not only with elements, we're not only with system, but we are already inside a larger story which somehow encompasses the beginning of the building up to its use. And we could go even further somehow, not only take in account the elements failure or the systems failure or the problem during the building process, but somehow deal also with the larger socio-cultural framework. So, for instance, in the case of the social housing and its failure, speak about the poor access to transport infrastructures, for instance. So we don't deal anymore with the building and isolated building, but somehow we begin also to think about the social cultural framework which is around this building. We could then integrate the question of typological deficiencies, economic factors, or high heating costs, and so on. But somehow, when we have all these categories, elements, systems, building processes, the social, cultural framework, we seem more to deal with symptom and not somehow with the causes. So we could say, okay, bad infrastructure, so we have to improve the infrastructure. Or we have failure in the concrete, so just pour a new concrete element. So, and this is a try to make a conclusion, and I really think it's a try to make a conclusion, and I would be very happy if in the discussion afterwards we could engage with some elements. So the question is, what can be learned from these failures, damages, accidents, ranging as they do from a single element to a whole construction up to a social technical system? I would argue that another perspective is necessary, one which does not try to separate these events into different categories, but instead tries to understand their underlying relation. As I told you before, my aim is not pessimistically. I do not want to somehow make a pessimistic assessment of architecture, but somehow I want to learn something about this history. Now, somehow, this link between these different elements, from the elements up to the social cultural context, the difference seems somehow unbreachable. What has the failure of a social program to do, has to do with a leaking roof or with a lightweight cladding element which is not soundproof. Yet, exactly in the same sense as a concrete detail that doesn't work, can be understood not only as a technical failure, but also as failure of its socioeconomic model. I would argue that in the same sense, a social project like Park Hill, Corviale in Italy, Abraxas in France, are subjected to the same logic as a technical object. We have, as we have for concrete elements, the same expectations. Somehow we hope that a concrete element will hold for certain years, will be waterproof, soundproof, and somehow we have the same expectation with social housing, somehow that the goal as we fix them are quantifiable and ascertainable, that they can achieve a certain performance, and that this performance can be measured in terms of costs, in terms of time, in terms of energy, in terms of hygiene, but also in terms of satisfaction. And this is true for the building itself. It has to be cheap. If we want to build this, as we expect somehow that the social project, for instance, has to be cheap. And we hope and we expect somehow that it will resolve eventually social crisis. And this calculable rationality which we impose on the technical elements, we impose in the same sense to the whole socio-technical system. And this is visible in the again and again updating of manuals, building laws, and regulations. So somehow the first element is which I want to try to show, that somehow architecture, not only in its constructional form, but in its larger thinking, is submitted today to a quantifiable performance. We expect it to be able to achieve. A second point which I would like to raise is this aspiration to objectivity, which is today linked, or which is linked to modern architecture. And this is not only true for the technicians, but this is also true for architecture and its discourse. And we can follow this throughout history somehow on various levels. For instance, on the level of the city, where somehow we think or we thought that we could divide architecture in four functions in the 1930s, or that we could somehow regulate in the 1960s the different flows, and that we could control the different flows which are happening inside the city, and that we could definitively somehow resolve this request, or in architecture somehow that we could determine definitively the right room size in the 1930s, or in the 1960s and 70s, that we could somehow find out what the patterns of life are, and that these patterns of life would not only be valuable for the 1960s somehow, but that they would be valuable or normative, norm-giving. And on the construction levels, for instance, insofar as the different components of a building are more and more divided in different layers, in different functions, which can be or should be calculated and planned accurately. This is visible, for instance, in the division of the wall in different layers. And Raymond Benham gives, this is a very interesting text of the 60s in social housing, where somehow the author claims that already with the new regulation they would plan the new slums of the future. And here this division of architecture, or this specialization of architecture, where its different components should be or could be quantified, is well described already in the 1970s by Rainer Benham, who describes somehow how Le Corbusier, who wanted to dissolve the wall into glass panels, had somehow to fix it again in a series of layers, and what qualifies these layers, that each of these layers has a specific function to perform: the brise soleil against the sun, the glass against the rainwater, etc. So the second point, what characterizes modern architecture, this modern history, is the specialization of architecture and the possibility, therefore, to quantify its various aspects. The third point, which comes out, I guess, from this analysis, is the growing importance of the various experts which deal with a building. Indeed, if every element of a building can be objectified and quantified, somehow you need somebody, a construction engineer, a building physicist, a traffic engineer, and the cyberneticians who is able somehow to qualify and quantify what is happening. And this is not only true for the building practice, but it is also true for academia, and this is somehow something which I see and which concerns me deeply in my daily work, is somehow how the different fields, the researcher in structural design, the researcher in preservation, the researcher in architectural history and theory, the researcher in building physics, the researcher in urban planning, somehow these different knowledges go back into the field of architecture and do not live their separate life. And all the way academia is today is shaped, goes into a direction somehow where the research field are more and more separated from each other. And this somehow has brought a paradigmatic change in architecture, as the challenge seems not anymore to be the answer to the old question of architecture, like the Vitruvian delight, stability and convenience, but somehow the challenge is always a search for an answer to a new question. So it's not anymore the old question which we have to resolve, but somehow we are expected to resolve always the new question: how to increase mobility, how to increase efficiency, how to increase sustainability, how to increase economic values. Yet, and this is the fourth point and last point, architecture is not only informed by experts, or contemporary architecture is not informed only by experts. Its parts are not only individualized and functionalized, and their performance calculated, but architecture as a whole is submitted to this logic of modernity. So the challenge is not so much to answer the singular problem of modern architecture, but somehow to think that the logic of modernity is today a prerequisite to architecture. The question is not how to resolve this or that technological problem, but how to make architecture inside a context that is more and more determined by the logic of the machine or the logic of production. The issue, therefore, is less an issue of formal innovation, I would guess, than of the necessity to engage with the condition of the architectural praxis. It lies less in the resolution of individual questions, such as energy saving, which of course is important, new production method like digital fabrication, which is important too, and far more in the mastering of this new condition. Therefore, this individualization, which I stressed out, has to be understood less as a division in different branches but as a differentiation, or the possibility of differentiation. The specialization has to be understood less as a delegation to others, but as a gain of knowledge. Performance has to be understood less in its individuality, but in all its temporal and spatial dimensions. This would force us to think about an architecture narrative less engaged with the urgency and presentism of architecture and its logic of production, than with its duration, enabling us to look more precisely upon the relation between discourse, technology, and architecture. These conditions request not only to engage in a broader way with architecture, but also for the historian or critic to postpone our judgment. Indeed, despite the disdain they received, Villa Savoye is today protected, Park Hill is today enlisted, and the engineering faculty in Leicester is again celebrated. Thank you very much.
Very good asking questions, so I will ask the help of the audience to engage in a conversation or ask some further questions to Laurent. Is there a starting deal? Thank you. This is always the hardest.
Hi, my name is Nadir.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Well, it's all very complex, all you said. Well, I could not eventually agree on the lightness, the light way you have talked about accidents, especially during the first modernism in the 30s. At the time, we didn't have even psychology, so it was a kind of, and it remembers me at this point, Beckett saying, fail again, fail better, with an objective, a clear objective. I don't know if it's the new, or is really the new humanity. But finally, today, facing all you showed us. I will ask you basically, what do you think is architecture linked with society going to collapse on this architectural production of product? I don't know if you understood. I was remembering while you were talking about Tainter and the collapse. We are talking about collapsing of a complex society. So, at this time, what do you think it's going really to happen forward?
Actually, I think my main argument was a first one, somehow, to question the logic in which we are thinking architecture. And it's a clear critique also to the way historians and theoreticians work with architecture, with a kind of urgentism and presentism, how to resolve the today question or the question of the future somehow. We are expected to plan future cities somehow without knowing what the contemporary city is. So this is for the ETH, for instance. We have a future cities laboratory without really knowing what was the historical city and what is the contemporary city. So this was the first aspect of it. And what interested me in the failure, and I think this goes very much into what you said about Beckett somehow, is that it's a moment also of discovery. And I think if we simply follow the track we have been following in the architectural discussion, somehow we will not be able somehow to engage with what happened in the past. And therefore, this was my main argument, somehow to think about the failure as a way to better understand what is happening today. And I think certain elements we cannot neglect, this kind of specialization, this individualization, this performance, but also this gives us the possibility to rethink, actually. As soon as you think performance in a longer time frame, for instance, it becomes much more interesting. Or as soon as you begin to think performance in a much broader sense, and not only fixed to an individual objective, it becomes much more powerful also for architecture. This was my plea. It was not, and again, for me, it's not a Virilio pessimist who sees somehow the train going to the wall. This is the function of the train somehow. But much more to understand how the train works. And this I tried somehow to fix. And of course, the perspective I've shown are limited. The perspective I've shown are biased. But I hope somehow that I could give some reflections through a historical overview of what is happening today. This was. So I think we're quite close to Beckett, yes.
I actually have one thing that interests me in your approach very much is the conditions of production that you spoken to study the real, let's say, how things are going, not only what are the things seen through the lenses of history and through the lenses of theory. And the theory doing this kind of analysis of, let's say, as you comment on the compartmentalization of knowledge. The elevator guys only knows about elevators, the facade guys only knows about facades, etc., etc. And then the architect, he has to find a way in between all of these different compartmentalized knowledges. What is how do you think a kind of this historical perspective could actually work through the daily practice of architecture? So to whom are we addressing as theorists or historians or thinking?
I think we address at different levels, and at each level somehow we have a different tools to do it. So I think there is still the plea for a good designed detail. So this would be somehow the question of the material failure. I think still this is an important argument, and perhaps it's an argument which is so important that we determine a much longer dimension of the building. And of course, on the political dimension, where as citizens somehow we can perhaps question certain logics which are happening in the field of architecture. And this is always the strange thing to see somehow, that the architects are the first one to think about formal innovations, and somehow when it becomes politic, they are not able to work together and to support this kind of claims. So I think there are really various levels of intervention, and I think we have to distinguish quite properly on which level we argue and on which tools are valuable to engage with building or with the built environment as a whole.
I was thinking you were speaking about postmodernism as opposed to modernism and all the history this past history. But I was thinking now about the change in paradigm, on the shift of the smart cities or intelligent cities. What would be your story about that? Because this is more or less all related, this history that you talked about.
Yeah, I think
but now it's a completely different era. Or
it's a very specific question, and so I think there are two aspects of it. The first aspect is the historical aspect. And to think that smart cities or complex environments somehow are only a contemporary issue probably lacks a certain historical depth in analysis. Of course, the smart cities has introduced a series of new tools, but I think the question of responsive environments, which has become so central today, is the key issue of public space. A public space which is not responded is not a public space. So this is the first question. And the second aspect is the role of these new technologies inside an urban development. So I think we all agree that we like our iPhones, that we like our computers, that we like flying, that we go far away for vacation. So that these are issues. But we, I think, should also all agree that this doesn't replace the whole systems. And the logic of the newness is exactly this. And I think the modern were much more differentiated in their praxis as in the way they were received in history or mediatized through media. Actually, Le Corbusier, when you see his urban houses inside Paris, there is probably not a better way of engaging with the city, with the historical traditional city. But what we have is somehow always the Chardin and its so-called replacement of the old city. So I think here we should also distinguish very much between the role this newness has inside a larger field. And of course you get grants with smart cities. You get elected with smart cities, but perhaps it's not enough. And I think it's the role of the historians, perhaps also the architects as historians somehow, to argue and to put this in a larger frame. And especially when you deal with the city, which is an artifact with a quite long duration, one should question the efficacy and the need somehow of a total change through a new keyword. So that would be, but I think it's important to make research on the smart cities and to understand them. I completely agree with that. And the exhibition on Paris Haussmann somehow is quite challenging because the question allowed somehow a group of historians to rethink and look at a historical city, to test certain models for which we have a plea. So sustainable city, and suddenly they propose or they pretend that somehow Paris is a very sustainable city because the ways are very short.
Okay. First, I'm not an architect, or I have no formation or whatsoever. I work with documentary, and I'm particularly interested in how to film failure in constructions.
To film failure.
Yeah, like,
yes,
and think about how this can be filmed, like film without. But this is just to contextualize. It's not a question about this. It's just so you know that I'm not. I don't have knowledge, specific knowledge. But my question would be, I've noticed, and I think it has always been like this, but especially in the last decades, I mean, there is some kind of fascination with the idea of the abandoned or failed constructions, being even buildings or social housing or amusement parks, or I mean, basically everything. I've read there's something like ruin pornos, so to speak. So I would like to hear, I don't know if you can comment on how this relates to what you're saying in terms of the value of, or the meaning of a construction that, even if it's demolished or not, but in the sense of something that has failed architecturally for some reason, and the permanence of this, within an environment where things are supposed to work and function, to be useful, so to speak, something like this.
This is a quite difficult question, especially if you bring amusement park and social housing somehow together. I think the question is right, and it's an old question also with the rune, the topic of the rune, which is a classical architectural topos. And the rune has somehow a lot of possibilities. It shows the dimension of time of architecture, so it's not like the classical architecture, which is perfect, harmonious and enclosed and finished things, but it shows somehow the passing of times, usages, changes of programs, etc. So this is certainly one important dimension of the rune. And the second dimension is also it's the non-achieved. So it allows the architect or the intellectual somehow to project in it either a past history or a possible future. And this has always been a key figure and a key topos of architecture and architectural history. And I think perhaps the aesthetic and purely formal fascination we have with decaying social housing probably comes out from this quite romantic tradition. But I would try somehow to try to differentiate between somehow the thing which completely failed and the unachieved, which has this creative potential. Actually, there is a very nice study which has been done by Tom Emerson, the English architect. Tom Emerson from 6A in London. He made surveys of different cities, and one of the cities is Glasgow. And Glasgow, instead of proposing this classical post-industrial project where we transform the city in a tourist attraction or in an amusement park, somehow they did with the students extremely precise mapping of different localities of Glasgow, just to unreveal its potential. For instance, showing the coexistence of the urban and the natural. Somehow suddenly the gaze is completely changed, because usually you would say, wow, this is an abandoned field. And they would, through the drawings, they would somehow say, no, there is a potential somehow to re-engage with the nature in the city. Or by juxtaposing a historical map with a contemporary map, somehow to show us the equivalence of different historical times inside the same place, inside the same city. And I think this is an extremely efficient method to rethink a city like Glasgow. Instead of thinking of this opposition, old, new, somehow thinking about the contemporaneity of these two dimensions. Glasgow Atlas, it's called. And it's all drawn with the same line. So every line is the same, no, not with one single line, but all with the same width of line. So the stone has the same quality like the grain elevator. Also, the edge of the grain elevator has the same line as the edge of a little stone on the floor.
question. You more or less at the end said that we should look those accidents not as categories, but relations. Do you think that schools of architecture and urbanism, are they open to this dialogue?
As always, I think it's a question of quality, and this is a difficult task with architecture. Somehow with an engine, you can just say, okay, you have to fix this part, and then the engine works again. And actually, architecture and urbanists have to deal with a much more complex set of conditions, and there always will be a compromise between the different tasks. And I think the difficulty is somehow when it becomes not anymore an issue of political debate, where we fight and we discuss about values, but somehow where certain values are imposed by economic pressure or by ecologic urgencies and so on.
Thank you, Laurent, so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all for your attention, and see you soon.